Published memoir, The Age of Turbulence, Alan Greenspan recalls his tenure as Federal Reserve Board chairman. His talk from George Washington University in Washington, D.C. is an hour 30 minutes.
So I gather you want to make a...
Good evening. I'm Carla Cohen. I'm one of the owners of Politics and Prose Bookstore in Northwest Washington. We are very pleased that Penguin Books gave us, with the Mid-Atlantic Venture Association, the opportunity to bring Alan Greenspan to Lisner Auditorium tonight. All of you know Alan Greenspan as the chairman for the Federal Reserve for 2 decades, that he had a dominating effect on the American economy. Alan Blinder, a professor at Princeton who served on the Fed with him, described him as arguably the greatest central banker in history. So the interest in the book is intense. We want to thank first Lisner Auditorium and GW for being such great hosts. Next, Julia Spicer from the Mid-Atlantic Venture Association will introduce her organization.
Thank you, Carla. I'll be very brief. At the Mid-Atlantic Venture Association, we're very proud to be associated with this evening's event and to have the opportunity to hear from Chairman Greenspan, otherwise known to many of us as the Maestro. Representing investors and entrepreneurs, part of MAVA's mission is to bring quality speakers and content to our members and also the Washington business community at large. It's our pleasure to be here this evening, and let me turn it back over to Carla.
Thanks, Julia. I think that many of you know that Alan Greenspan will be in discussion with Dan Yergin. Both of Dr. Greenspan and Dr. Yergin are part of the Politics and Prose family. Alan Greenspan is actually related by marriage, since Andrea Mitchell, his wife, has been a friend and supporter of the bookstore since we opened 23 years ago. Dan and his wife, Angela Stent, have both presented books at Politics and Prose. Dan is uniquely qualified tonight to be in discussion with Alan Greenspan. He's the chair of the Cambridge Economic Research Associates. His second book, The Prize, The Epic Quest for Oil, Money, and Power, won the 1992 Pulitzer Prize, and that was a really prescient book. His most recent book, Commanding Heights, The Battle for the World Economy, was published about 5 years ago, and he's at work on an eagerly awaited new book. Dan will engage Alan Greenspan in conversation for about 25 minutes, and then we'll pose the questions that you have submitted. Excellent questions. We've been through them, and there are many really provocative questions. There will not be a signing at the end. There are signed book plates in each book. Again, I want to thank you all for coming tonight and want to welcome Daniel Yergin and Alan Greenspan.
I would call that a pretty enthusiastic welcome. So, welcome, Dr. Greenspan, and certainly welcome to all of you here this evening. Thank you, Carla, and thank you to Politics and Prose Bookstore, which is such a force in Washington, D.C., and also our thanks to the Mid-Atlantic Venture Association, which represents a force in its own right. Our subject tonight is really twofold. One is to talk about a book, The Age of Turmoil, Adventures in a New World, which is, of course, this book is just out a few days, and it's already hitting the bestseller lists around the country. And the second subject is the author, Alan Greenspan. All of us, I think, know his image bounding up the stairs, briefcase under his arm, with no comment. And tonight is indeed the opportunity for comment. So we'll get to know the man behind the book without any of that curious dialect of English called Fed speak, or at least not too much of it. But we'll begin by talking about the book. It's a wonderful book. It's actually, from an economics point of view, it's a great deal because it's really two books for the price of one. And one, about halfway through, it glides from one subject to another. So we'll talk about the writing of the book, some of the news and big questions that have come out of it, help frame the discussion, and then turn to the story and then come back and talk about the future. But the first question I wanted to ask you, Dr. Greenspan, are you a little disappointed that the book hasn't gotten much attention?
Yeah.
When you were sitting in your bathtub writing the book, and he has, I gather, an unusual type of bathtub, did you expect this kind of reaction?
It never entered my mind that I would get very many readers. And indeed, when, as you know, the embargo was broken on the book on Saturday, and I said, gee, I got a reader now, I know about it.
Well, we knew it was 3 because it was broken on 3 front pages
Oh,
simultaneously.
it's 3, the sales are 3 times what I thought
readers.
it was. Oh, that's nice.
But I guess it's been, I think we've all, anybody who follows the media knows it's been an incredible, amazing onslaught and a little dizzy for you. And I think you've had some unusual experiences and bounding back from it. And you mentioned one today that sort of showed you where you were at.
Well, in fact, I wasn't quite sure where I was at because I was doing something for National Public Radio. And I said, where's the makeup lady?
I think that was about the time he thought maybe this book tour is starting to go on a little bit. Well, let's talk just a little bit about the writing of the book. And you said that the hardest part of writing the book was using the word I. Why?
I'm essentially fairly deeply introverted, and I've spent my life being an objective observer, a technician, an expert on certain subjects, and I'm always viewing the external world as, in a way, trying to describe it without any reference to me as the observer. And everyone told me that unless you want 4 readers and maybe 5 as the maximum, you're going to have to get yourself into the book, which means writing in the first person. And I had never done that before. And it was extraordinarily difficult, but what was fascinating to me as I began to learn it is that it opened up a lot of avenues as to where I could venture with respect to ideas, hypotheses, and the like, because it's a very big difference when you're trying to say that such and such an event caused another event because of, and you have a long list of factors, or in some cases a mathematical model. Going from there to I think that certain sort of relationships exist forces you to open up a much broader range of how you think about things. And even though it's not as exact as you would like it to be in, say, just viewing something objectively, it is nonetheless engaging in that you're giving a lot of your own views.
Did you feel that you learned things either about yourself or about the world from the process of sitting down and reflecting and writing?
Oh, sure. In fact, I was learning all the way. And the first draft, by the time I got to the, say, 17th or 18th chapter, I proved definitively that certain views I held in chapter 3 were false. But it's 13 or 15 chapters worth of learning that was in there.
Good. Well, we'll talk about some of the things you learned and your own experience as a person. But I suppose, and I guess the backstory to the book, there's been so much written about it, but it was interesting to see Robert Samuelson's column in the Washington Post today, where he pointed out during your 18-plus year tenure at the Fed, the U.S. economy grew by 70%, which I think kind of puts a context around the story and about how America changed. But as I think anybody who's been reading newspaper, watching TV knows that this book has actually engendered a good deal of controversy and argument. And I thought right at the beginning we would take them head on. And number one, this question of, were you a critic of spending and tax cuts, or did your views change? And I think each day it's been striking to see how this has changed. Yesterday, President Bush said he respectfully disagrees with you. And today, Vice President Cheney, in an op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal, said, quote, your assessment is off the mark, which I think was a way of saying you're wrong, in his view. So, can you...
You suggested some doubt in that remark. Well, no, you're actually asking two questions. I mean, the question is, did I change my mind? As a lot of people have said, I had a view with respect to the tax cut at the time it was initiated, and I've only in retrospect revised history, which is one issue. The second is actually the question as to my views with respect to what is essentially, in my judgment, a very sad case of the progression of the Republican Congress from when it took over as a majority in the early 1990s and when it lost the majority in 2006. Those are two separate questions. Let me try to do the first quickly. It's basically an issue of evidence. When I approached the tax cut issue in the beginnings of 2001, where everyone, including the best experts in the Federal Reserve, were arguing quite persuasively that we were about to deal with a very large year after year surplus in the budget. Included in that was the expectation that by 2006 the debt would be effectively paid off, which meant that according to these, most everybody's figures, we were going to have a $500 billion surplus in 2006. And if you pay off the debt, there is only one thing you can do with those funds, is to put them into private securities or, to a lesser extent, in state and local securities. There's no third option.
So the U.S. government would turn into a mutual fund?
Well, it was a huge mutual fund, because you're talking $500 billion a year, and then it was supposed to rise thereafter. I had been through Lyndon Johnson's regime and Richard Nixon's, and I have no doubt in my mind that they would have used those funds for political purposes to get corporations to do what they chose to do. And I thought that was a very extraordinary, I just thought that was a disastrous thing to happen. So having been a deficit hawk all those years and just looking and savoring the surplus that occurred in 1998, I believe, I all of a sudden realized that there were problems with surpluses.
So we should have a tax cut.
Only surpluses with regard to a debt going to effectively zero. And without getting into the mechanics of it, either the Bush tax cut or the tax cut of the Democratic minority would have served my purpose of essentially bringing down the prospective surplus by 2006 effectively to zero. So the issue would not come up of accumulating, you should say, a mutual fund. That outlook turned out to be just plain wrong. By 2002, we were already beginning to see the huge surpluses disappear rapidly. And at that point, having argued in the testimony in 2001 that we weren't really sure that the surplus was there, we ought to have a trigger, which meant that tax cuts or anything else that increased the deficit had to be reviewed and indeed probably altered automatically in the event the forecasts were wrong. And then on top of that, when the surplus disappeared, I began to argue that I was in favor of the tax cut, very specifically the partial reduction in the double taxation of dividends, which most fiscal experts tend to be in favor of. But I said the tax cut, which I favored, however, had to be paid for, meaning that the pay-go requirements of the federal budget requires that you do that. It wasn't required when there was a surplus, but it then became a requirement. So by 2003, my view of the tax cut was conditional. I wanted to see it provided that there were reductions. So I did change my mind, but I changed it 4 years ago.
Right. Okay, thank you. Let me ask you the second question that, of course, has been in the press much, the housing bubble, and was the Fed responsible for it? And we've certainly heard much of that.
I find that a very difficult conclusion for people, largely because the evidence against it is startling. There was, from I guess the early 1990s forward, probably 20 or more countries around the world, all of whom were experiencing this dramatic drop in long-term interest rates and therefore mortgage rates, which occurred for reasons I explained in the book as a consequence of the end of the Cold War. Everybody is behaving similarly, and you look at the actual trend of prices in homes, country after country after country, and they all look right smack on top of everybody else. If anything, the U.S. numbers are somewhat less than the average. Now, when you see an extraordinary correlation where everybody's economy is behaving the same way, you need a Rube Goldberg explanation of why it isn't a single force that's doing it. And since there is such an obvious single force out there, as I try to explain in the book, the question as whether the Fed did it seems sort of beside the point. Now, more importantly, in a certain technical sense, we did try to raise mortgage interest rates in 2004 and again in 2005, and we failed. And the reason we failed is that we could not raise the longer-term rates as we moved up short-term rates, which is another way of saying that the international forces were so dominant that they were suppressing our mortgage rates irrespective of what the Federal Reserve did.
I think that's one of the big themes that comes through the book, and I think I have the sense that that was, in a sense, one of the things when you had the chance to sit down and look at the big picture was what these big international forces were that were changing the position of the U.S. economy and the world economy. And you've said it goes back to the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Most foreign economists think it's an international phenomenon. It's only a few American economists who think there's something terribly special about the United States. There was a certain irony here. When we at the Fed cut rates down to 1% of the federal funds rate, I was a little bit concerned that we may, in fact, produce some sort of bubble. Now, the irony is that, as best I can judge, looking at the data, looking at the flows of funds, looking at the various aspects of the banking system, is I was mistaken. We were not creating anything which would induce a rise in the price of homes in the United States. And the evidence is unequivocal in my judgment. I just don't understand some of the other arguments were made in opposition to that.
And it is, I mean, you do see it as part of this great transition that had happened with the end of the Cold War.
Oh, yeah. In other words, you can see...
If I can just jump in, I mean, I had the sense that that is one of the sort of major things that came into focus for you when you actually were writing the book.
Well, it started to come in focus in the latter years of my tenure at the Fed, and indeed, some people may remember that we were very puzzled why, when we raised short-term interest rates, unlike most of the time, long-term interest rates did not move. And I eventually said, this is a conundrum. for which...
That was a famous conundrum.
It was a famous conundrum, and I found within a few weeks I'd gotten 10 bottles of conundrum wine.
So, how was it?
I don't even know what the vintage was. I didn't dare drink the stuff.
Who knew what was in it?
That's precisely. A conundrum, by its very nature, is
risky.
Unknown.
But the background to the conundrum was this movement of...
Yeah, in other words, at that point, I and a lot of my colleagues at the board started to really ask ourselves, what is it out there that is preventing the markets from behaving the way they always did? And what is it out there which is disinflating the American economy so vigorously? And while we were acutely aware that globalization in general was a significant factor, we hadn't identified the individual components. But in writing the book, what I did is go step by step in trying to go from what was the extraordinary event when the Berlin Wall came down, and there was a startling sense of economic ruin behind the Iron Curtain, which even the most pessimistic people about what the state of Eastern Europe was surprising. And there was a dramatic geopolitical shift in the world. Most of the third world then was thinking in terms of some form of central planning to organize their economies. But the evidence of central planning's failure was so unequivocal and devastating that everybody quietly, unceremoniously, without fanfare, without seminars, debates, or anything else like that, shifted. I mean, China is the critical example, which is, of course, the big operator here. In 1980 and before, you couldn't have foreign direct investment in China by law. By 1991, they had gotten it up to $4 billion a year. Then, as the evidence of central planning began to fade, you had the most remarkable rise in foreign direct investment in China, which, as I recall, went up more than 20% a year and is now more than $70 billion a year, which means a very large number of people believe they can invest in China and get their money back, which means they trust their property rights, even though, as you know, the legal constitutional aspects of property rights is a very vague law, and the People's Congress, which passed one earlier this year, is an improvement, but it's obvious that de facto everyone believes they've got property rights.
Well, one of the things that comes through in the book, of course, is that when you were a young man, you would have been considered part of a very small minority of very right-wing, libertarian, market-oriented people. And you describe how even in 1970s, when you were head of the Council of Economic Advisors, you'd go to Europe, you and only one other person thought markets were a good thing. Turn around today, and the world has pretty much embraced markets, more or less. What do you make of that? You're no longer a small minority.
I like it.
Did you think it would happen?
No. No, actually, the other person, and this was an OECD thing, was Hans Tietmeyer, who subsequently became president of the Deutsche Bundesbank before the European Central Bank, and became one of the really prominent central bankers in the world. So he did well, too.
Yeah, the two of you.
Yeah.
I think at this point, the most famous sentence in the book is on page 463, for those of you who already have your copies. You say, "It is politically inconvenient to acknowledge what everyone knows, the Iraq War is largely about oil." There's now been an industry the last few days interpreting what you mean by that, and what you don't mean by that. And so this is, let's clarify it.
Yeah, I was referring to my view of what was going on in the world. I had been watching Saddam Hussein for 20 or 30 years, taking very specific action which led to one central goal, if he ever were to reach there, which is to gain control of Middle East oil. I mean, he first, as you know, in 1990s, secondly, actually, he was fighting Iran. Before then, 1990, he moved into Kuwait, was threatening Saudi Arabia. And just watching what he was doing, it became very clear to me that he was looking to finally control the Straits of Hormuz, which is the channel through which 18 or 19 million barrels a day of Middle East oil flows into international trade. It struck me that the real scary danger there was if Saddam got himself a nuclear weapon, and as far as I was concerned, he was trying to get one, because remember, we weren't altogether certain, and I'm even surprised to this day, that the demise of the Soviet Union opened up an awful lot of possibilities for a lot of weapons to leak out into the world. And we've been very fortunate, for reasons I'm not even clear on, as to how that was avoided being done. But if he got a weapon, I was reasonably well convinced that he would then try to make a move on the oil-producing countries, control the Straits of Hormuz, and essentially take out 5 or 7 million barrels a day out of world crude oil supply, and that would have crippled the industrial West.
So it's really about the stability of the world economy.
People are not aware how fragile our tie to energy is, even now. And, you know, we're struggling with $80 per barrel oil, but I wasn't thinking $80 per barrel. I was thinking 130, 150, 170. It would have been devastating. So I was looking for any way, frankly, to take him out of there. I mean, bin Laden was nowhere near the threat that Saddam was. So my initial view was if there is a war in Iraq and Saddam is taken out, that is a positive plus. What I obviously was not happy with was what happened subsequent to that, because that's a wholly different story. But there's no doubt in my mind that the war at least did something useful, which was basically to get Saddam out of there.
Right. One more question to ask about current events. As I think you know, the Fed cut interest rates yesterday.
They did.
Yeah.
They did.
I know he's been on this book tour. He thinks he needs makeup and National Public Radio. He's missing he's not reading the papers. And we know that it's your policy not to comment on current Federal Reserve policy, but I wondered if you care to comment.
Nope.
Okay. Maybe
just let me just say something, though. The one thing that is fascinating about the Federal Reserve is it's unique in Washington as a government institution. I think it's got more PhDs per square foot than anybody else, and it is an extraordinarily effective operation. You don't always know whether the actual policy in retrospect turns out to be right, but boy, I will tell you, the way they go about making decisions, you know, from the staff level, through the governors, through the Federal Open Market Committee, is really impressive.
At a time like this, not this time, but a time like this, what does it feel like to be on the hot seat? Does it feel like a hot seat when there's all that pressure coming from all the different
You know something, if pressure gets to you, you shouldn't be in the job. And I think the people who can handle it best are those who take those types of jobs. I found that I wasn't aware of the pressure I had been on for years and years and years. It was subliminal, and the first day I left office, which was February 1st, 2006, I said, I feel very unusual. In other words,
lightheaded?
It was light-shouldered, I guess. And the first time I got into an elevator, and for the first time in almost 20 years, I walked in alone. Previously, I always had security all over the place, right. And it's a liberating feeling, I can say.
You didn't mind the feeling?
It's great.
Right. Right now, we're not obviously speaking before Congress with just a small group of friends. You describe yourself again and again in the book as what you really think of yourself professionally as an economic analyst. Your first really good call on the macroeconomy was you called the recession of 1958. But then you say that forecasts are more art than science. Earlier this year, you talked about a 1/3 chance of a recession. You finished the book in June. You talked in the book about the danger of protracted periods of low risk premium. Wearing your analyst hat, how do you look at things today? Where are we?
The one thing which I learned in the book, which I'd always thought about, but never realized until I focused on it, how important it is the extent to which economic behavior around the world is determined by innate human nature. You can define an extraordinary number of actions, but when you're able to measure the degree of euphoria or fear, you really have a judgment of what is going on. I mean, I've been schooled in all sorts of econometric techniques. In fact, I go back to when econometrics was originally called mathematical statistics. And the conceptual techniques are awesomely impressive. The problem essentially is that we can't forecast any better now with all of these techniques than we did, say, 50 years ago when I first started.
So, I mean, what would be your call today on the economy, on housing?
Well, I mean, basically, today what we're observing is a freezing up of the international financial system, which obviously has been easing in the last several days, actually even before the Fed moved. And what this is in one variation or another of exactly what we were looking at in 1998, 1987, 1907. The degree is different, but the economics of fear is out there, exposed in every particular way, in every particular episode. And fear is an innate human trait. You cannot learn not to fear. In other words, if you're threatened 100 times and you get fearful, but nothing happens, the 101st time you will still be as fearful when the event occurs.
So what do you think people should be expecting now? You say it's easing,
well,
housing's still a big worry?
Fear disappears and eventually eases down. The big problem, which I've been commenting on, which is confronting us, is the fact that because of the very dramatic decline in home sales, most importantly, new single-family constructed homes, and the inability of home builders to stop the construction cycle sufficiently rapidly, we have built up more than 200,000 units of newly built, largely completed homes which are deteriorating because you have to maintain them, and it's very difficult to maintain vacant homes. And what we have observed now is the pressure of those inventories on the market have taken home prices down probably about 3, maybe 4%. But the actual level of construction, even though, as you know, today housing starts continued down and permits continued down, we are not that far under the rate of comparable sales, so we're only pairing very small amount of inventory each month.
So would you change your 1/3 chance of a recession?
I think that the 1/3 which I made back in March probably has to go up some. I don't think we're at 50% at this stage. And one of the reasons is I sense that this credit crisis that we're going through has some of the characteristics of easing. And we don't yet see any really serious erosion, certainly in the U.S. economy, and the global economy still is doing well.
So higher than 1/3 and less than 50%.
Yeah, I mean, you know, you want 42.3.5 or something like that?
I'm sure some people do. Several decimal points, please. Listen, let's talk about the story in the book, and in a way it's the road to the Fed. You didn't go the route of a banker, it was advisor, analyst, consultant. You're a child of the Depression. When you were growing up, what was your ambition?
I wanted to be a Major League Baseball player,
Right.
like 110% of all kids of my age.
And then when you get beyond that, what was your next ambition?
Then I wanted to be a professional musician,
Right.
and I actually became one.
At the age of 17.
17. But as I point out in my book, I was traumatized very early in my later amateur period when, as a saxophone player at the age of 16, they sat me next to a 15-year-old kid by the name of Stan Getz.
It was downhill from there.
And, you know, you don't know that, you know, you're not experienced enough to know that this kid is not the average of everybody. Right. And actually, I really indirectly thank him for inducing me to make the most important economic decision I ever made in my life. Quit the music business and go into something else.
Because I guess you finished your career as a professional musician by the time you were 21?
By the time I was 18.
Okay. But it was from your mother that you got, was that where you got your love of music from?
Yeah, my mother was one of these unusual people who, no matter what the world was doing to her, and she was pretty hard-pressed in her life, she was always cheerful, and she would sit and play the piano, and she was a sort of a torch singer. Torch singer, for those of you who are not 102 years old, is what used to happen in the 1920s, and she essentially was brought up in the 1920s. I have a picture of my mother, which I loved. She's 16 years old, and she's in a tennis dress, and the dress goes down halfway to her toes, and she's got one of these old wooden rackets. Yeah. And it's really sort of a wonderful view of what she was like.
Do you think you got your temperament from her?
I'm sorry, what?
Your temperament comes from her?
I wish I was benevolent as she is, but yes, I just generally am, I guess.
One of the things I was struck by, of course, one of the themes in the book and themes of your life is mathematics. You describe yourself as a math junkie, and as a child, you mentioned that your mother, instead of, when you were with relatives, instead of having you sing or recite poetry or dance, do mental arithmetic.
You know, that was my first moving out on the stage. They'd sit me in the middle of the floor and they'd say, you know, add 163 and 46. I think I'm 6 years old or something like that. I can't do it today.
In other words,
but
he was good at math. He was good at math. No, I want you to know, before we came out here, he was doing square roots in his head, so to prepare. But so that really prepared you for doing mathematics in front of Congress. I see the continuity.
Well, I do too. I hadn't seen it before.
Right. But when you described that for you, you would love, when you were young, you'd rather than read Gone with the Wind, you'd rather read Chilean silver ore statistics or copper ore statistics. Interesting reading, but this love of numbers that you have, but you've talked about when you look at numbers and tables and so forth, I think you react differently than many people, and you see pictures.
Well, it's funny. I wasn't aware I was doing it, but my first job, which was in 1948, was at the then National Industrial Conference Board, now the Conference Board. And I was sort of a research assistant. And I'd sit in the library and look at all of these figures on, you know, whether it's copper ore or steel or something like that. And I didn't understand what they meant. And so I used to get books. I mean, there's a huge volume called the Shaping and Making of Steel, which is sort of the technological volume for steel engineers. And since I got into looking at the steel data, I got fascinated by how steel was made. You know, when I saw tubular goods, you know, what in the world are they talking about? And I get this big book, and it was about 800 pages, and I read it. And I had a sense that the numbers became real to me. In other words, I could really see how it worked in the economy. And one of my vivid memories is I got up before the American Iron and Steel industry, about 10 years ago, and I said, I am certain that I was the only chairman of the Federal Reserve who has ever read The Shaping and Making of Steel. And they loved me.
Right. There's the home team.
Yeah.
But so numbers for you, I mean, you really do take great joy in numbers.
Well, yes. In other words, I'm fascinated with everything which is exact. In other words, numbers are concrete measures of various things. Usually in economics, they're trying to measure, you know, what standards of living are, how people are doing. You know, when you look at poverty statistics, you know, you basically have to visualize what those things really mean, and you can't do it unless you have a broad notion, not of what the numbers are, but what it means to individuals who are involved in that. And it's a remarkable education that I've been through, and it enables you to go to actually do a great deal of interdisciplinary analysis, because I got into a whole number of different areas beyond economics, largely in part because of math. I mean, I got into looking at physics and astronomy and a variety of other math-related types of.
So it's really a basis for you. Of
yeah. I used to love to, sit down and struggle with advanced math problems.
I mean, he was really doing square roots before we started.
I was not.
But I think he was making up the answers, so I'm not sure. Your father was sort of in and around Wall Street, was a stockbroker. You didn't see him much when you were growing up, but he wrote a book in 1935, just in the Depression, called Recovery Ahead, about the New Deal. And in it, he wrote, when you were 9 years old in the flyleaf, may this initial effort with constant thought of you branch out into an endless chain of similar efforts, so that at your maturity, you may look back and endeavor to interpret the reasoning behind these logical forecasts and begin a like work of your own, your dad. It
was an eerie feeling to find that book many years after I was 9 years old. I think I was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors when I ran into it on the shelf, dusty. And of course, I, at the age of 9, didn't have a clue what was in that book. And I could just look like an affectionate thing, because my parents were divorced when I was 2. And I didn't see that much of my father, but he, you know, father figures are father figures. And it was sort of a very eerie feeling to read that. Some people read that and they think that Fed speak is inherited.
But it must be, it speaks to you across the decades.
Yeah, you know, 1935, it's a long time ago.
Yeah, at that point you were not thinking about the Fed.
No. Well, rather, I should have been thinking about the fact that there was major dispute in 1935, and they passed very important legislation which created the Federal Open Market Committee.
Right. You're a little harsh on yourself in the book a couple of times. When you talk about meeting Ayn Rand, the philosopher, you say, until you met her, you were a talented technician, but that was all, and that she was a stabilizing force in my life. What was the impact on you?
Well, I mean, going back to the mathematic issues, I had in my early 20s become what was then called a logical positivist. It was a philosophy which came out of the nuclear advances in the Manhattan Project. And it was an extreme form of empiricism, where if you couldn't measure it, you didn't know anything. And when I ran into Ayn Rand, and I started espousing this extreme form of empiricism, she asked me, do you exist? And I said, well, obviously I can't be sure. And she said, and who is making that judgment? And the internal contradictions hit me in a way it's hard to define, because if you build up your whole epistemology in terms of what essentially is an empiricist's view of understanding the world, and then realizing that it's internally inconsistent, it alters your whole way of viewing things, and that fundamentally is what drew me to much of what she was doing.
So that was a turning point for you?
It was a significant turning point, not in my view, for example, of capitalism and the like. I had already concluded empirically that that was an exceptionally desirable system, but it enabled me to understand that you have to look at human beings, how they behave, what they are, what are societies, issues all of which I thought were outside the realm of rational consideration. And it had a profound effect on me.
You had, and I guess a lasting effect. She was at your swearing in when you became head of the Council of Economic Advisors.
That's correct, yes.
Your career as an economic consultant meant trying to understand how economies were working. One gets the sense very strongly that one of the things you really like doing is explaining how the economy works. And it is striking in the book that the first conversation you had with your wife, Andrea Mitchell, was when she called you up to kind of ask you how part of the economy was working.
I vaguely think it had to do with the Social Security, well, maybe not. I think I'll ask her at some point. I vaguely think
she might remember more clearly than you.
It was several decades ago. But I was then chairman of the Social Security Commission at the time.
Right. But it is, much of your career really has been, in a sense, your preparation for the Fed was understanding how the economy works.
Exactly. I mean, I could not have had a better grounding in knowing what I would have needed to be chairman of such an institution.
Right. Now, but it sounds like you almost missed the call to be chairman of the Fed, literally, and maybe you could tell the story of when the call came, the problem of the call from President Reagan.
No, actually, that was a formalistic call. If it never had been made, it wouldn't have mattered much. But I was at my orthopedist, and I had previously gotten a call from Jim Baker, who said the president's going to call you. And I eventually got called out of the orthopedist room. They said, there's somebody calling here from the White House. Is that conceivable? They want to speak to you. I said, possibly, let me talk to them. And it was Reagan who wanted, officially asked me to be chairman of the Fed.
According to what's in the book, they said after you got the call that you really looked like you needed a doctor. Just a broad question about being chairman of the Fed. There's a tendency to kind of mystify it, and the Fed is an incredibly powerful institution. Is it as, from the other side of the door, is it as powerful? Does it feel as powerful? Is it?
No, actually, I think it's, in most recent years, much less powerful than we think. I'm effectively saying, and that's what I experienced, that global forces were beginning to have a very significant impact on global economic events. And there's no doubt in my mind that all central banks are actually less powerful than they were in years earlier. I think that in a way is for the good. I think there's a balancing force in the global markets, which we at the Federal Reserve couldn't really reproduce as well as the markets themselves do. In many respects, as I say in the book, and you pointed out the Robert Samuelson thing this morning, he says that a lot of the accomplishments during that period were, part of it was luck, part of it was skill, but he's right about a lot of it was luck, because we happen to be in a period of disinflation and falling mortgage interest rates. And since the real problem that central banks always have is fighting inflation, to be in a disinflationary period makes monetary policy a lot easier than it is when things are turning. And one of the things I believe I'm demonstrating in the age of turbulence is that we're in a turning point here. That is, my successors will not have it as easy in making policy as I and my colleagues did.
Yeah, it's a point you really emphasize in the last chapter, the Delphic, called the Delphic something, but in which you say that the big problem is at some point we're going to lose this bounty of low inflation that we've had, and that's where a lot of economic and political troubles will come.
Yeah. What we're dealing with is something we can't be sure of at this stage, in that I'm reasonably certain that the post-Soviet thing, the post-Soviet change, is a one-shot force, and that we seem to have gotten to its maximum point of disinflation, and we're probably coming out of the other side. And the other side is a gradual diminution of the disinflation, which is another way of saying inflationary pressures will likely start to rise. There are some very early, and I must say inconclusive, indications that that may be happening. We're seeing unit costs begin to go up here in the United States and elsewhere, and you begin to see prices beginning to pop up lots of different places around the world. In no case are we talking about, the types of inflation we really are aware of.
But what you do point out that when that happens and inflation comes back, the pressures and the difficulties of being a central banker increase.
Yes, very much so. And my main concern is that there is a degree of populism in this country which has been dormant for quite a long period of time. But it's something I worry about when the trade-off between inflation and unemployment begins to shift. You're going to require ever higher interest rates to maintain the same level of inflation. And having gone through what Paul Volcker, observing what Paul Volcker had gone through, when he had this extraordinary set of pressures to deal with, and had to raise the federal funds rate over 20% to over 20%, the political response was awful.
Right.
I mean, he was accused of everything, and they wanted to impeach him. They wanted to do even worse. And when it turned out that he was right, everything calmed down. But what I frankly found really most disturbing is there was an amnesia which sort of came upon the whole political system. Nobody remembered the things they were saying. Nobody said, we were wrong, no, you shouldn't have been impeached, you got it right. It's as though it didn't happen. And I'm concerned that we're going to find that the degree of populism, as I said, which the last time I sensed any of it was the early 1990s. since then we haven't seen it, but I see no reason to hope that somehow it will disappear, although I say in the last chapter which I call 2030, that chapter basically is one that is suggesting that the Federal Reserve will, obviously, by its institutional memory, suppress or try to suppress inflation. But remember, the independence of the Federal Reserve is by statute. Congress can change it, and I'm worried that we will begin to get a series of things which people will begin, in other words, the political system will begin to start pressing on the Federal Reserve and make it very difficult for them to do what has to be done in a period like that.
I checked that I want to correct the record. The chapter I was referring to is called the Delphic Future, so I want to be sure to have that as a record.
The future is 2030.
Right.
So I didn't want to forecast next year. That's tough.
Right. But and we're going to get to that in just a minute, and there are a lot of questions from the audience that I'm going to bring into it.
Yeah, it's like the reason that I called it the Delphic Future is the first part of that chapter is going back to the Oracle at Delphi, and I asked the question, how much can human beings project into the future? And the history is fascinating because whether we can or we can't, you go back as far in history as you can, and the desire to do so is just a constant. Even, today, the Wall Street firms, instead of having the Oracle tell them where the stocks are having everybody looking at the entrails of the way stock prices run. And throughout history, there's the notion, Nostradamus, became a very important force. It's human nature. We have to speculate about what the future is going to tell us. The fact that we don't do very well never seems to inhibit us.
It remains an evergreen industry. So we're going to do that in a minute. But first, as I was thinking about this event, I was thinking that I don't think there's anyone else in the country who has worked closely with 6 out of the last 7 presidents and insights into all of them, and we don't have time to talk about all of them, but I thought I might just ask you a couple of questions about that. One, going back, contrast Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford.
Richard Nixon was extremely intelligent. I first met him, he was a staid Wall Street lawyer, articulate, he was immaculately dressed. He'd speak in complete sentences. His syntax was perfect. He organized his thoughts in extraordinary ways. And when I actually was a volunteer economic aide in his campaign, I would often brief him for 5 minutes on some complex issue which he could not have any knowledge of previously. He'd go out in the press corps and hold forth for 20 minutes, acting as though he were a professional. I mean, it was really a very extraordinary thing. But I eventually was let in on the inside, and it was devastating. I, who of course was in the music business and had a very large vocabulary of 4-letter words, had them augmented to a very substantial degree. And when the tapes were, when there was a big question, whether the tapes would be released, it was being, I said, I know exactly why he does not want to release those tapes. Right. Because he was, he was very conservative, he wasn't, some of the phrases and words and attitudes would have made Tony Soprano blush, as I say in my book. It is a Jekyll and Hyde like I've never seen. Jerry Ford, on the other hand, was one of the most decent people I had ever encountered, especially in Washington. He may not...
It's interesting that Vince is a laugh here in Washington.
He may not have had the intelligence of, say, a Nixon or a Clinton, but he had character. I mean, there was a camaraderie in the Ford administration which occurred as a consequence of the man's character. And over the decades after he left office, reunions of former members of the Ford administration were always very largely attended. In fact, what always disturbed me is that the number was actually increasing year after year.
As the word got around.
The word got around there was a good deal to be in the Ford administration, even if you never were, obviously.
Of course, the press has made a lot of your relations with both the Clinton administration and Bush 43 administration. I think that struck so many people who have written about it is here you were a libertarian, right-wing, free market Republican.
Actually, no, I'm not a right-wing in that sense. I'm a libertarian. That's a different issue. Oh, what's that?
What's the difference? Tell them the difference. Tell them the difference between libertarian and right-wing.
A libertarian is someone who believes that individual rights are critical and that the state should not be engaged in imposing its will on what individual people do, other than enforcing the law, property rights, and other things that are essential for individuals to be, to essentially do what the Enlightenment philosophers thought was the proper state of man. In other words, the least state interference in the actions of human beings. Right-wing has got all sorts of meanings. Right. I won't try to do them all, but I reject that label.
Okay, I was trying to paraphrase the writing that you as a libertarian Republican were so close to the Clinton administration, but I think, and somewhat estranged from this administration, but I think yesterday it reached a new level, which if you were quoted correctly on Fox, and I'm not sure if this necessarily would help Bill Clinton, but you called him the best Republican president we've had in a while.
Well,
floor is yours.
The problem with Bill Clinton is that if you look what he believed in free trade, he believed in welfare reform, he believed in balanced budgets, and I can go on, and I'm saying he believes, 80% of what I believe. And I can't say that was the case for the most recent years of, say, the Republican Congress, who were doing things which struck me as quite alien to my Republican views. I mean, I started off as a Goldwater Republican, and that is smaller government, smaller spending, more economic freedom, less regulation, pro-capitalist, and the party has drifted. I don't know where it is going at this stage, but it is no longer the party that I recall. And I'm not trying to say that Bill Clinton is a Republican. Obviously, he's not. But it is remarkable how many views that he holds, which incidentally is not a democratic, aberration. There's always been a very significant proportion of the Democratic Party which overlaps many of the civil liberties views that Republicans hold.
He hasn't called you about that quote yet, has he?
I haven't heard from him.
Okay. Let me, thank you for answering those questions. There are a lot of questions here about the present and the future, beginning with energy, which is a subject I know which you're very interested in. A couple of years ago, actually, as some people here will know, you emerged as the nation's #1 natural gas expert at the time discussing LNG. Why are you so interested in energy?
Largely because it is a very complex and dominant industry in the world, and it is so important to what we all do. We are not aware in our day-by-day existence how crucially we are dependent. That, for example, this 85 million barrels a day of crude oil actually moves out of many states which are various forms of authoritarian and unreliable states, and that it requires a great deal of infrastructure and rule of law to get that oil into the world markets. And it's fascinated me for many years. Indeed, it got me so fascinated I read your book.
Thank you. That was a commitment.
The name is The Prize, and incidentally, Dan, it is a first-rate book, real seriously.
Thank you. Thank you.
You taught me a lot, and I appreciate that.
What do you think, when you look at the energy situation today, what do you think the center of U.S. energy policy ought to be?
Well, I think it's apparent, starting with the early 1970s, as you know as well as I do, we lost our energy independence because the excess amount of crude oil which existed in the Texas Gulf, U.S., basically since much of it was in the state of Texas directly, and had been used always to augment the world supply whenever prices began to be pressured, which gave the United States the price leadership in the world. We lost that. And we've been struggling ever since with the issue of independence, which makes no sense unless you're talking about you can somehow control the price. We cannot control the price of oil, and there's no even remotely conceivable scenario which suggests that we will in the future. And I argue in the book that we've got to cut back on oil consumption in this country. I mean, it's hard to realize, but every 7 barrels of crude oil that's produced in the world is consumed on American highways.
So how would you go, would you use the book?
In the book, I advocate a $3 gasoline tax.
Do I hear any applause?
Spread out over a few years and rebated in some non-gasoline-related form. And the basic reason is that...
With a rebate, in other words, to lower income.
Yes, basically there. But we're now dealing with global warming, which is a CO2 problem, and clearly the only way you're going to reduce CO2 emissions is to bring down the amount of use of fossil fuels, and petroleum is a very big one, and where we have the most leverage is actually on the highways. I would exclude highway diesel because that does integrate with the economy, whereas motor gasoline consumption generally does not.
You mentioned, obviously, climate change, and probably in this city over the next 2 years, we're going to see a rising crescendo of debate about how to address it with a cap and trade or with a carbon tax, which could be a gasoline tax. What's your advice here?
Well, I think we all have to conclude at this stage that the scientific evidence that we are in a global warming trend is pretty much irrefutable at this stage. And while there is a question as to what will happen in the future years, it's fairly apparent that it's pretty disturbing. And so the question is, how do we reduce the amount of CO2 emissions or other various forms of greenhouse gases. And there is no way that you can do that without reducing output or changing the technology. There's no third alternative. And as you know as well as I do, the International Energy Agency, which projects just a relatively modest increase in petroleum consumption, it's got a continued increase pretty much proportionately in CO2 emissions. And we are talking about, under the Kyoto Agreement, to go back to the 1990 or less. Our problem is going to be, it is extremely difficult to prevent the rise from 2007 to 2030. And it's very simple to talk in terms of carbon taxes or cap and trade, but the basic problem is that unless we can get the technology to change significantly, you cannot reach the goals that we're talking about without a major decline in economic growth at a minimum, and very likely an absolute decline in output and employment. Now,
that's a very...
Well, I find it very disturbing. I don't think that the notion, well, if you put, everyone agrees you have to get the cost of energy up to get the use down. But there's a general belief out there that all you have to do is to put a cap on either, say, a carbon tax or its equivalent, a cap, which is a cap on emissions, and you will engender a fairly significant increase in technology, which will solve the problem. I wish that were true, but we have too many examples of that not happening. For example, the one most related here is that we've been operating for years trying to get battery technology in cars to essentially displace the gasoline motor. And we haven't done all that well. I mean, granted, the hybrids are a clear advance, and I say in the book, at the end of the day, we may end up, of necessity, having to drive electric plug-ins. I'm not talking about hybrids. I'm talking about something you plug in at night. Nobody likes that. But I will tell you, if the alternative is, $20 a gallon gasoline, I don't know what number, I'm trying to say something shocking. But we can far more readily maintain an electric-based motor vehicle fleet, because as you know, if you plug in overnight, the load factors in the utilities are way down, and the amount of new infrastructure for electric utilities to meet a very large increase in the demand for plug-in cars or plug-in or hybrids either. The amount of electric power construction need is not that great.
There are several questions, energy-related questions but a lot of them actually have to do about the relationship between oil prices and the dollar. We notice that oil's at $80, but the dollar goes down in value. Is this just coincidence, or is this...
No, remember, a lot of people say, let me just take a step back. We have extremely efficient foreign exchange markets in which unlimited amounts of monies can be transferred between the dollar and the euro or the yen and sterling. And as a consequence, it doesn't really matter what price oil is transacted in, because it could just as easily be any other price. The real question is, on average for individual countries, what the cost of energy is. Clearly, if your exchange rate is firming significantly, you will find relative to other countries that your price is going down, and vice versa.
There are several questions here. Is $80 a barrel, $50 a barrel was not a threat to the economy, it turned out. Is $80 a barrel oil a threat to the U.S. economy?
Well, Dan, so far, I'm hard-pressed to find it operating that way. In other words, when we in the United States got a $3 plus gallon of gasoline, you would have thought our 9 million barrels a day of motor gasoline consumption would start, to edging down. I don't think we lost a liter.
Right. We have only about 15 minutes, and there are a bunch of questions that maybe, so I'll run through a few of them that I think are really important. There are several questions. China, partner or rival, or both?
I think they've gone too far towards capitalism to be other than a partner. In other words, they basically are at a point now where they are so dependent on the material prosperity, which is clearly occurring in China, that the Politburo, which no longer is talking Marxist economics or communism, you don't hear ideology all that much in China, but material well-being is what gives them the capability of being an autocratic state. And were, for example, in my judgment at least, ever to re-engage the American Seventh Fleet in the South China Sea, for example, relevant to Taiwan, foreign direct investment would dry up very rapidly, and the effect on its economy would be devastating. There are several examples which I raise in the book indicating that I think they've gone beyond the point where they are capable of retrenching and getting back to the authoritarian type state.
So we're too integrated. They're too integrated.
I believe so. I don't think they're a threat. I think they are a growing economy which, unless they fall on their face, which I don't foresee, but they have a lot of problems. But remember that economic growth is not a zero-sum game.
Which people often forget in terms of trade.
I'm sorry, what?
People often forget that in terms of
Yeah,
trade.
in other words, China's benefits, or advance, is not at our expense. I mean, in fact, what over the years one sees is that trade enhances everybody's output and standard of living.
Right. In the age of turbulence, there are two topics that cause you a lot of turbulence looking to the future. One is Medicare, and the other is this whole question, and you remarked to me, it hasn't been much discussed in terms of the book, but it's a big concern in the book, inequality. So maybe we take
Inequality of income.
Inequality of income. Yeah. So let's just share your thought on what the worry is about Medicare, and then how we deal with the issue, the nature of the problem of inequality of incomes.
The problem with Medicare is that we have at this stage an entitlement which can be funded at the existing level of retirees. But we are about to go through one of the most extraordinary demographic shifts in world history as huge numbers of people begin to retire, and indeed the population doubles, the retiree population doubles at the same time that we've got the baby bust generation producing the goods and services which will be required to for the living of the workers and their families and the retirees. I mean, remember, the only thing that the entitlement is a claim on future goods. And as a consequence of that, when you look at the underlying data, including the trustees' report and the Medicare trustees, it's quite apparent to me, and I think most economists who look at the data closely, that we are significantly underfunded. And that this means that we are going to need to either increase taxes or reduce benefits. And when I look at the size of the changes that are implied, if it were all done with taxes, I think there's a serious question as to whether we'll slow economic growth, slow the tax base, and not actually get the revenues that the tax increases would create. If that is the case, and I sincerely believe it very likely is, it essentially says that the current benefit is going to have to be cut back. But nobody wants to even utter the word. And I'm looking at presidential candidates from both parties. They just stay away from that. There's a lot of discussion of Medicare, but it's all to increase benefits, even though we are essentially severely underfunded.
So it's a big crunch.
Well, I think it's an unethical to immoral position to take, because there are a lot of baby boomers who will be retiring in the years ahead who think they are entitled to a certain level of Medicare, and we are not telling them that that may not arrive. And they therefore are they are now in a position where they can make decisions like decide to retire later, not sooner, and solve the problem. But if we wait until they retire and say, oops, we forgot to tell you, we don't have enough resources to meet everybody's needs, that's going to be a terrible situation.
And that's part of in that Delphic Future chapter, and you deal with that. The other question you deal with is your concern about growing income inequality in the United States and how to address it.
This book is basically a extraordinary analysis as far as what our history has been. It's paean to capitalism, market capitalism, and what it has done since Adam Smith and David Hume and John Locke visualized relationships in society which had never existed before, and which created a huge increase in per capita income, that is the creation of a capitalist society, huge increase in population, because now you could sustain it, and a very dramatic rise in life expectancy, as well as all sorts of other considerable advantages. But it is in the nature of capitalism, and it's a theme running through the book, that it never seems to get acceptance by the vast majority of people. And the reason is that one of the key aspects of capitalism is competition, which is a very difficult thing when you are competed out of business. In other words, it's what I call in here, Schumpeter came up with Joseph Schumpeter, the famous Harvard Austrian economist, came up with a fascinating discussion of capitalism called creative destruction, in which you move the least productive facilities, the obsolescent facilities, to the most productive cutting-edge facilities, and with it creating higher income per capita. But you are essentially forgetting that there are a lot of people on the destructive side who are losing their jobs, have all sorts of problems.
And I think you're saying that inequality is increasing in the United States.
Yes, inequality is increasing. The data are just very clear. Part of it is the result strictly of the rapid increase in technology. But the reason I say it's crucially important is that you cannot have the benefits of capitalist market growth without the support of a significant proportion, and indeed virtually all of the people. And if you have an increasing sense that the rewards of capitalism are being distributed unjustly, the system will not stand.
So in shorthand, what's your recipe for addressing it?
Well, my shorthand is essentially, one, to recognize that a goodly part of the problem is the decline in primary and the decline in our primary secondary education system, which I go into in some detail. And there are studies which show that our fourth grade students are average in math and science worldwide. By the time they get to the end of high school, they're way at the bottom.
So it's education.
It's education, and really the most controversial thing I've got in the book is to augment immigration of skilled labor. We pay the highest skilled labor wages in the world. If we would open up our borders to skilled labor far more than we do, we would attract a very substantial quantity of skilled labor, which would suppress the wage levels of the skilled, because we skilled are being essentially subsidized by government, meaning our competition is being kept outside the country. But if we bring in a number of workers to suppress the level of wages relative to the lesser skilled, we will reduce the degree of inequality. And it's, as I point out in the book, for reasons which is really fascinating on some certain studies that have been taken, they're now generally accepted, that the level of real income of people is not what determines whether they are happy or not. It's their pecking order in the society. It may be a discouraging view of human nature, but that's what we are, whether we like it or not. It really matters to us where we are. You know, if real material well-being were the determinant of happiness, you couldn't get this huge increase in per capita income without any evident increase in happiness of the people involved. And therefore, the issue of income inequality is a very difficult and very important issue that must be addressed in this country.
Let me before coming to a couple of last questions, just flag something that I think might surprise the audience. But towards the end of the book, you say, arguably the single most important economic decision our lawmakers and courts will face in the next 25 years is to clarify the rules of intellectual property. This is an immensely complicated subject, but can we just in a compressed way get a sense of what you're putting your finger on?
Well, one of the things I point out is that the proportion of economic output in this country, and indeed all other countries, that is conceptual as distinct from physical. In other words, if you measured the actual number of tons of materials we put into our gross domestic product, you would be surprised at how little it is rising. Yet the real value, the inflation-adjusted value, is rising very rapidly, and therefore a hugely disproportionate amount of economic growth is conceptual in nature, and it is ultimately protected by intellectual property rights. And as I go in the book, there's some very difficult problems of intellectual property rights, and I have certain fascinating passages from Stephen Breyer, who at the time he was writing, 1970, was not prominent. Something happened to him subsequent to that, but who knows?
Right.
But it's really fascinating. The insights back in 1970 are really now have not been improved upon. And there are very technical problems with respect to intellectual property. You know, the question is, should we grant a patent to the calculus? In other words, if Newton and Leibniz had effectively had property right, let's say in perpetuity, for example, on the calculus, the world would not be anywhere near where we are today. It's a very tricky problem. I don't know if I fully addressed it in the book.
I guess I would say to people, read that section in the book. It's page 498. Two final quick questions. Since many of the theme of the book is about you as counselor advice, one person sends up a question, what is your advice for a young person just starting out in their career? I presume that's from a young person. And so...
Well, what helped me most was an extraordinary desire for knowledge. I mean, I'm still turned on. I'm 81, and I'm just voraciously trying to learn as much as I can about everything. And what I found is that no matter where you are, no matter what you do, if you're smart, it pays. Right.
Wherever you are, ask that question.
This means, you know, go to school. And remember, not all learning is formal. I mean, I learned a great deal just by reading. And there are certain things which I think you do better by reading than in class. I mean, I always found reading mathematical textbooks were by far superior to trying to figure out what somebody is chalking up on the board, because it's a different procedure. So the issue is learning, not necessarily formal learning.
Right. I think the last question, I know that you wouldn't be giving advice to your successor, Bren Bernanke, but what advice, looking beyond him, would you give to the future chairman or chairwoman of the Fed and to future presidents about the economy?
What we are in the grip of is one of the most extraordinary events in human history. Globalization, which has freed markets and had the effect of reducing poverty worldwide by hundreds of millions of people. It is a huge, very difficult system to understand, almost impossible to regulate. And I call it essentially the Adam Smith version of the international invisible hand. It's a self-regulatory system which is continuously converging the incomes of the developing nations to the developed nations. It's been a remarkable force for good. And if we fall back on various forms of protectionism, we're going to be slowing the advance of civilization. With respect to my friends at the Federal Reserve, they're all extraordinarily well qualified to do what has to be done in this type of world. And I'm sure that the generation after Ben and his colleagues will be the same, because there's nothing like the Federal Reserve.
Thank you. Dr. Greenspan, on behalf of everybody this evening, I want to thank you for sharing with us first this wonderful book, The Age of Turbulence, and sharing with us both your story and your thinking. We're very grateful. Thank you. You're getting a standing ovation.
Alan Greenspan served as chairman of the Federal Reserve Board from 1987 to 2006. For more on the Fed, visit federalreserve.gov.